Web fonts. Now, the add font face rule has been around for quite some time, and this allows you to import your own fonts. However, it's not the most easiest directive to use because you need to have different font formats for the different computer platforms, and think of these as images. That's download time for the user. A more productive way to go would be to use Google hosted web fonts because they're already hosted on the internet, they're already cached, and many people use them. So there is a little bit of download time, but not as much. And this is how it would work. You would refer to the Google font in the link element and refer to it in the font family, the name of that font, like you would any font family property. Transparency in CSS3. We have RGB alpha transparency. If you're familiar with Photoshop, you're familiar with our alpha layer. And this makes a color transparent. In the world of transparency, 0 is totally transparent like a window. You can see through it. 1 is totally opaque like a wall. So we should be familiar with our RGB syntax, and the A, the alpha layer, would allow us to indicate a value anywhere from 0 to 1. And developers often put a 0 in front of a decimal just so that you know, it makes it easier to see that that is a decimal rather than just a little mistake. So here we see some examples. If we had some text with different levels of transparency, how it would look on a pinkish background. We also can use transparency on the web with our HSL values, hue, saturation, luminosity. You don't see too many people using HSL at this point. We're more familiar with RGBA, but this is allowed also in CSS3. Now, one area of progressive enhancement, which we looked at in the first video, has to do with how we write our CSS. If you need to write some code for older browsers and the more CSS3 enabled browsers, you'll always want the more modern code to go last. The browser reads from the top down. So first it will read the older code and apply it, and then if it understands the newer code, it will apply that. If it doesn't understand the newer code, you still have what is called a fallback for the older browsers, such as IE 9 and 8. So they will still have something there also. I would also like to point out the opacity property. The opacity property is different than RGBA and HSLA opacity. RGB and HSL has to do with the color. The opacity property affects the entire selector, whatever that selector may be. So here, if we were to put a 0.5 opacity on a container, you can see the first container made with RGBA transparency only affects the color. You can see the wood showing through the color. However, if the whole container had opacity, the whole container would be opaquish. Notice it's not just the color purple, it is also the text, the border, everything. So I just wanted to make that distinction there.